January 17, 1945. Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The winter air hung thick with moisture, clinging to the barbed wire like morning dew on spider silk. Inside the compound, rows of wooden barracks stood in geometric precision, their walls weathered gray by Gulf Coast humidity. Through the frosted window of Barack 14, a young woman pressed her palm against the cold glass, watching American guards move between buildings with an efficiency that felt almost leisurely. Her name was Greta Hoffman. 23 years old, a former Luftwaffe Communications auxiliary captured 3 months earlier during the collapse of the German Western Front. The package on her bunk behind her, wrapped in brown paper and tied with ordinary string, had arrived that morning. She had not yet opened it. She did not understand why it existed at all. In the collective imagination of the Third Reich, surrender meant annihilation. The propaganda films Greta had watched in Berlin showed Soviet camps as death pits, British prisons as starvation chambers, and American facilities as something perhaps marginally better, but still fundamentally punitive. The Führer himself had declared that captured German soldiers could expect no mercy from the degenerate democracies. And yet here, in this compound carved from Louisiana pine forests, packages arrived. Not from the Red Cross, though those came too. These packages bore the return addresses of American civilians, housewives in Monroe, farmers from Shreveport, church groups in Baton Rouge, people who had never met these German prisoners, would never meet them, and whose sons were at that very moment fighting and dying in the Ardennes and across the Rhine. The psychological architecture of National Socialism had prepared German women and men for many outcomes of war. It had prepared them for heroic death, for glorious victory, for tragic but noble sacrifice. It had not prepared them for kindness from the enemy. The story of German female prisoners of war in American hands began not with grand military defeats, but with the gradual, grinding collapse of Hitler's auxiliary services. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht had mobilized over 500,000 women into support roles. The Nachrichtenhelferin who operated communications equipment, the Verkäuferinnen who assisted anti-aircraft batteries, the Stabshelferinnen who managed administrative duties. These women wore uniforms, lived under military discipline, and worked in zones of active combat. When Allied forces overran their positions, the question of their status became immediate and complex. Under the Geneva Conventions, they occupied a gray territory. They were not combatants in the traditional sense, yet they served essential military functions. The United States, adhering strictly to international law, even as its enemies did not, classified them as prisoners of war entitled to all protections thereof. Between October 1944 and May 1945, approximately 3,200 German women in uniform were captured by American and British forces. The majority were transported to the United States, where they were distributed among existing POW camps in the South and Midwest, regions chosen for their distance from strategic targets and their capacity to house the massive influx of prisoners that followed each Allied victory. Camp Ruston opened its women's section in November 1944. The facility already held several thousand male German prisoners, mostly from Rommel's Afrika Korps and Italian campaign. The women were housed separately, behind additional fencing, in barracks that had been hastily renovated to provide privacy and security. The American command understood that female POWs presented unique challenges, not discipline or escape risk, but a perception and protection. In a culture that still viewed white women through Victorian lenses of vulnerability and propriety, these captured German women generated immediate public curiosity, mixed with odd, uncomfortable sympathy. What neither the prisoners nor their captors anticipated was how American civilians would respond to their presence. Greta Hoffman had expected hatred. She had been raised on it. After all, the Reich's propaganda apparatus had spent 12 years teaching Germans that Americans were materialistic, racially impure, culturally degraded. They were a mongrel nation of gangsters and plutocrats, capable of industrial production perhaps, but spiritually hollow. Jews and blacks held disproportionate influence. Their democracy was a sham designed to disguise the rule of international finance. Their soldiers were cowards who relied on overwhelming numbers and material superiority rather than warrior spirit. These beliefs had been necessary to sustain German morale as the war turned. When the Wehrmacht still marched across Europe, Americans could be dismissed as irrelevant. But as the tide shifted, as German cities burned under endless bomber streams and Allied armies pressed from all sides, the propaganda grew shriller, more desperate. Americans were not just inferior, they were existentially dangerous. Captured Germans, the radio broadcast warned, could expect torture, starvation, forced labor unto death. Greta had believed this completely. Why wouldn't she? She had never met an American, never read an American newspaper, never heard any voice that contradicted the state's narrative. When the convoy of trucks carrying her and 60 other women rolled through the Louisiana countryside toward Camp Ruston, she had looked out at the neat farmhouses, the vast fields of cotton stubble, the small towns with their white churches and general stores, and felt a curious cognitive dissonance. The landscape looked prosperous, orderly, undamaged by war. But this, she told herself, was just the surface. The reality of American life, the poverty, the racial violence, the exploitation, existed behind closed doors, just as the propaganda promised. Then the packages began arriving. The first one appeared in early December, addressed simply to the German girls at Camp Ruston in careful cursive handwriting. Inside were knitted socks, homemade cookies wrapped in wax paper, bars of soap that smelled like lavender, and a handwritten note. Dear young ladies, we are praying for your safe return home. These are small comforts for winter. God bless you. The Ladies' Circle, First Baptist Church, Ruston. The women gathered around the package in stunned silence. Margaret Schultz, a former Flakwaffen-Helferin from Hamburg, turned the soap over in her hands as if it might be a disguised weapon. Why would they do this? She asked no one in particular. Were the enemy, the camp commandant, Colonel James Whitaker, had been equally surprised when the package arrived at the gate. But he was a career officer, a veteran of the First World War, and he understood something about the strange contradictions of the American character. Americans could be ruthlessly efficient in war. He had seen that at Belleauwood. But they were also deeply uncomfortable with cruelty, especially toward women. The Puritan conscience ran deep, even in those who had never set foot in a church. It produced a compulsive generosity, a need to demonstrate mercy even to enemies, perhaps especially to enemies. Whitaker approved the delivery. Within a week, more packages arrived. By Christmas, the women's barracks were receiving parcels almost daily. The phenomenon spread through Louisiana and beyond with velocity that suggested it answered some profound need in the American home front psyche. In Monroe, a group of school teachers organized a drive to send blankets and warm clothes. In Shreveport, a grocery store manager collected canned goods and chocolate bars. In New Orleans, a society club that had spent the war years rolling bandages and organizing scrap metal drives decided to adopt the German women at Ruston as a project. The motivations were complex and often contradictory. Some women felt genuine Christian charity. These were young women, after all, far from home, and regardless of their nation's crimes, basic human decency required kindness. Others experienced a kind of proxy maternal instinct, imagining their own daughters in similar circumstances and responding to that imaginative empathy. Still others saw it as a demonstration of American superiority, proof that democracy produced not just material abundance but moral abundance, that Americans could afford to be generous even to those who had sought their destruction. The letters that accompanied the packages revealed this mix of sentiment. One woman from Alexandria wrote, "My son is fighting in Belgium. I hate what your country has done. But you are someone's daughter, and I cannot hate you personally." A farm wife from Opelousas sent jars of preserves with a note explaining that her husband was dead, killed at Anzio, but that she did not believe in punishing women for crimes of men and governments. A group of college students from LSU sent books, English novels and poetry collections, with a letter saying they wanted the German women to understand American literature, American values, to see what they had been taught to hate. Not everyone approved. Some local newspapers ran editorials condemning the practice as misguided sentimentality that dishonored American servicemen. The Monroe Morning World published a letter from a Gold Star mother who wrote that every ounce of kindness shown to German prisoners was an insult to her son's memory. But these voices were minority positions. The packages continued to arrive. For the prisoners, each delivery triggered a small crisis of worldview. The propaganda they had internalized insisted that Americans were incapable of genuine altruism, that any apparent kindness was manipulation or weakness. But the evidence accumulating on their bunks told a different story. The cookies were real. The socks were warm. The soap smelled like someone's grandmother's bathroom. These were not the products of a degraded civilization. Greta Hoffman opened her package slowly, carefully preserving the paper and string as she had been trained by years of wartime scarcity. Inside, she found a knitted scarf in soft gray wool, a tin of butter cookies, 3 pairs of thick cotton socks, and a small book, a collection of poems by Longfellow in English. The note read, "Dear young woman, I do not know your name or your story. I know only that you are far from home in a difficult time. These winter months are cold in Louisiana. I hope these small things bring you comfort. May you see your home and family again soon. With sincere regards, Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, Baton Rouge." Greta sat on her bunk, the scarf across her lap, and felt something crack inside the careful structure of her beliefs. This woman, this American woman whose country Greta's nation had declared eternal enemy, had spent time knitting this scarf, had chosen the yarn, had worked the needles through long evenings, had wrapped it carefully and paid postage to send it to a prisoner she would never meet. There was no strategic value to this act, no propaganda benefit. It was, as far as Greta could determine, simply gratuitous kindness. She put the scarf to her face and, for the first time since her capture, allowed herself to weep. The historical record documents these gift-giving campaigns with surprising detail, preserved in camp administrative files, personal letters, and post-war interviews with both prisoners and American civilians. What emerges from these sources is a portrait of cultural collision. 2 ideologies meeting not on the battlefield, but in the mundane exchange of scarves and cookies and canned peaches. The scale of American civilian generosity toward German POWs extended far beyond Camp Ruston. At camps across the United States, in Texas, in Wisconsin, in New York, local communities organized similar efforts. The pattern was consistent. Initial curiosity about the prisoners, followed by organized charitable response, particularly toward female POWs. The gendered nature of this response is significant. While male German prisoners received decent treatment as required by the Geneva Conventions, adequate food, housing, medical care, they did not generally receive gifts from civilians. The presence of women prisoners activated different cultural scripts about femininity, vulnerability, and appropriate response. But the gifts were only the most visible manifestation of a broader truth that German prisoners discovered about American society. The food in the camp mess halls presented its own form of cognitive dissonance. Under the Geneva Conventions, POWs were entitled to rations equivalent to those of rear echelon troops of the capturing nation. For German women who had lived through years of escalating rationing, who had not seen real coffee or chocolate or butter in quantity sufficient to satisfy appetite since 1941, the American camp meals were revelatory. Margaret Schultz, in her memoir published in 1958, described her first week at Camp Ruston in almost dreamlike terms. We were given white bread, actual white bread, not the gray sawdust loaves we had known for years. There was butter. There was meat that was recognizably meat, not mystery sausage or watery stew. There were vegetables, fresh and canned. There was coffee, real coffee, and sugar put in it. On Sundays, there was sometimes ice cream. Ice cream in a prisoner of war camp. The abundance was not accidental. American agricultural and industrial production during the war years achieved levels that would have seemed impossible in 1939. While Europe starved, while German rations fell month after month, while British children were evacuated to the countryside and Japanese civilians ate acorns, American farms produced surplus crops. American factories outfitted not just American forces, but equipped Allied armies on every front. The Lend-Lease program sent mountains of supplies to Britain and the Soviet Union. And still there was enough to feed millions of prisoners of war at caloric levels that exceeded what many Americans themselves consumed during the Depression. This abundance was strategic. Of course, the United States understood that well-fed, properly treated prisoners were less likely to resist, more likely to provide intelligence, and served as walking advertisements for American power. But it was also ideological. American leaders believed genuinely that democracy produced prosperity, that free markets and free people generated wealth that authoritarian systems could not match. The POW camps became inadvertent showcases for this proposition. German prisoners noticed, in letters home, heavily censored but revealing nonetheless, they wrote about the food, the medical care, the absence of brutality. These letters reached Germany sporadically, but they reached POW camps in Europe more reliably. German soldiers learned that surrender to Americans meant survival, adequate food, safety. This knowledge affected surrender rates. Wehrmacht units on the Western Front surrendered in increasing numbers as the war moved into its final months, while resistance in the East remained fanatical. The distinction was not primarily military but ideological. Surrender to the Soviets meant probable death. Surrender to the Americans meant survival and, improbably, cookies from Louisiana housewives. The symbolic object that came to represent this entire experience, mentioned again and again in memoirs and interviews, was chocolate. Not combat chocolate, not the bitter duration bars that American soldiers carried and complained about. Real chocolate, civilian chocolate, Hershey bars and homemade fudge, and chocolate chip cookies that arrived in packages from American women. Chocolate had disappeared from German civilian life early in the war. Cocoa was imported, and the British naval blockade had cut off tropical supplies. By 1943, chocolate existed in Germany only as a memory and a promise. The propaganda promised that after victory, after the Jews and the plutocrats were defeated, there would be chocolate again. There would be coffee and oranges and all the tropical luxuries that a victorious Reich would command. Chocolate became attached to the mythology of post-war plenty, the reward for sacrifice and endurance. And here, in a prisoner of war camp in Louisiana, surrounded by barbed wire and guards, German women ate chocolate almost daily. The absurdity was not lost on them. Ilse Werner, a former stabbed Schelferin who spent 7 months at Camp Ruston, wrote in a 1952 letter to an American friend she had met years later, "The chocolate was a thing that broke through my resistance to believing what I was seeing. I could rationalize the buildings, the guard behavior, the medical care. These could be explained as pragmatic, as calculated to prevent disease or unrest. But the chocolate from the civilians? That was different. That was unnecessary. That was Americans giving us, voluntarily, something we had not tasted in years, something our own government could not provide even to loyal citizens. Every piece of chocolate was an argument against everything we had been taught. The chocolate became a running joke among the prisoners, but a joke edged with something darker, more unsettling. They called the packages ideological warfare and laughed about it, but the laugh was uneasy, because it was working. With every gift, every scarf, every tin of cookies, the narrative structure that had organized their understanding of the world weakened slightly. If Americans were degenerate, why were they so generous? If democracy was weak, why had it produced this overwhelming material superiority? If the Führer's prophecies were true, why had everything turned out so differently from the promises? The transformation happened slowly, unevenly, with resistance and backsliding. Human beings do not abandon their core beliefs easily, especially beliefs that have been reinforced through years of education, social pressure, and state violence. Some women at Camp Ruston never changed their fundamental national socialist convictions. They accepted the gifts while continuing to believe that Germany's cause had been just, that defeat was a result of betrayal or misfortune rather than systemic failure. They interpret American generosity as weakness, confirmation that the democracies lacked the ruthlessness necessary for survival in a hostile world. But others underwent genuine ideological crisis. Greta Hoffman filled a notebook with questions during her months at Ruston, questions she had never been permitted to ask in Germany. Why were the guards so casual, so unmilitary in their bearing, yet so effective at maintaining order? Why were black soldiers treated as equals by white soldiers in ways that contradicted the propaganda about American racial hierarchy? Why did the American women who sent packages seem genuinely concerned about prisoners' welfare rather than resentful? Why did the camp library contain books that criticized the American government, newspapers that reported on American failures and controversies? If America was a dictatorship of capital, why was dissent so open, so unremarkable? She had no answers. The commanding officer, Colonel Whitaker, had instituted a program of educational lectures for prisoners who were interested, voluntary attendance, no compulsion. The lectures cover American history, civics, the structure of democratic government. Greta attended skeptically, expecting crude propaganda. What she found instead was something stranger: self-criticism. The American lecturer, a professor from Louisiana State University, discussed slavery, the Civil War, Jim Crow laws, labor struggles, the persistence of poverty and racism in American society. He did not present America as perfect or unblemished. He presented it as a work in progress, a society attempting imperfectly to live up to its stated ideals. This, more than anything else, was alien to Greta's experience. The Third Reich did not admit imperfection. It did not question itself. It presented a totalizing narrative of historical inevitability and racial destiny. The idea that a government could openly acknowledge its flaws and shortcomings while still claiming legitimacy was conceptually foreign. By March 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final convulsive phase, as German cities burned and armies collapsed, the women at Camp Ruston listened to BBC broadcasts and read censored versions of American newspapers. They learned about the liberation of concentration camps, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau. The photographs and reports were fragmentary, heavily edited, but sufficient to convey the basic truth. The camps existed, the murders had happened, the regime they had served had committed atrocities of unimaginable scale. Different women responded differently to this information. Some rejected it entirely as enemy propaganda. Others accepted it, but insisted they had known nothing, had been deceived as much as anyone. A few accepted it and collapsed under the weight of guilt and complicity. The psychological landscape of the barracks became fractured, tense with unspoken accusations and defensive silences. Into this atmosphere, the packages from American civilians continued to arrive. Their persistence, the fact that even as the full horror of the Nazi regime became public knowledge, American women still sent scarves and cookies to German prisoners, created yet another layer of cognitive dissonance. By what logic did this make sense? By what system of ethics did Americans extend mercy to women who had, however tangentially, supported such monstrous crimes? The answer, when Greta finally articulated it to herself, was both simple and profound. Americans genuinely believed, in human dignity as something inalienable, not contingent on nationality or ideology. They believed that even enemy prisoners deserved basic decency, because that decency said more about America than about the prisoners. It was not mercy as weakness, but mercy as strength, as confidence in the superiority of democratic values. This was the ideological defeat that no military defeat could have accomplished alone. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The news reached Camp Ruston by afternoon, and the women gathered in the recreation hall to listen to the announcement on the radio. There was no celebration, no relief, only a kind of numb recognition that the future they had expected, the victory they had been promised, would never occur. They were now citizens of a defeated nation, their homeland occupied, their cities destroyed, their families scattered or dead. The packages did not stop. In fact, they increased. American civilians, reading about the devastation in Europe, about the millions of displaced persons and the looming humanitarian crisis, responded with characteristic generosity. The care packages sent to Camp Ruston now included practical items for eventual repatriation, sturdy shoes, durable clothes, basic toiletries. The note spoke of hope for reconstruction, for peace, for reconciliation. In June, the first group of women prepared for return to Germany. The logistics were complex. Transportation was scarce. Europe was in chaos. The occupation zones were still being organized. But the process began. Greta Hoffmann was scheduled for repatriation in July, part of a group being shipped to Bremen, and then dispersed to hometowns across the British and American zones. On her last evening at Camp Ruston, she sat in the barracks writing thank-you notes. The American women who had sent gifts had included their return addresses, and Greta felt compelled to acknowledge their kindness. She struggled with the English, worked through multiple drafts, finally produced a letter that read, "Dear Mrs. Thompson, I am returning to Germany soon. I want to thank you for the scarf and cookies you sent in January. They brought me comfort in a difficult time. More than the gifts themselves, your kindness made me think about many things I had not questioned before. I do not know if you'll ever receive this letter, But I wanted you to know that a young German woman learned something important from you about what it means to be human. I hope I can carry that lesson home with me. With deep gratitude and respect, Greta Hoffman. She never knew if Mrs. Eleanor Thompson received the letter. The mail systems between occupied Germany and the United States were unreliable in those first post-war months. But the act of writing it mattered to Greta, represented her attempt to cross the unbridgeable distance between who she had been and who she was becoming. The voyage home was long and uncomfortable. The conditions on the transport ship crowded and stark after months of American abundance. Germany, when Greta finally reached it in August, was unrecognizable. Hamburg, her hometown, was a landscape of rubble and ruins. The apartment building where she had grown up was gone, replaced by a crater and scorched foundations. Her mother was alive, living in the cellar of a damaged building on the city's outskirts. Her father had died in the final days of the war. Her brother was missing, probably dead somewhere in the east. They rebuilt slowly, like millions of others. Hamburg recovered. West Germany recovered. Underwent the economic miracle that transformed it from devastation to prosperity within a generation. Greta married, had children, worked as a secretary and later as a translator. She lived an ordinary life, outwardly indistinguishable from millions of other German women who had survived the war and adapted to the radically different world that followed. But she kept the gray wool scarf. Through decades of normalcy, through marriage and children and the routine challenges of peacetime existence, the scarf remained in her wardrobe. It was worn now, carefully mended, no longer used except on rare occasions. When her daughter asked about it in the 1960s, Greta told her the story about Camp Ruston, about the packages, about the American woman who had sent a gift to an enemy prisoner. Why did she do it? Her daughter asked. Greta folded the scarf carefully, running her hands over the familiar texture. I think, she said slowly, because she believed that even enemies are human, that even in war, even when there are good reasons for hatred, it is important to remember that. It was her way of saying that America would win not just with bombs and soldiers, but with the values that made those things serve justice rather than tyranny. Her daughter, raised in prosperous democratic West Germany, educated in schools that taught careful lessons about the Nazi past, found this moving but slightly abstract. She had never known the world where such gestures were necessary, where the difference between democracy and fascism was a matter of survival rather than political science coursework. But Greta remembered. She remembered what it felt like to have certainty shattered, to discover that everything you had been taught was false or incomplete, to realize that the enemy possessed virtues your own society lacked. She remembered the chocolate, the absurd, impossible chocolate in a POW camp while German children starved. She remembered the notes from American women, the careful cursive handwriting, the expressions of concern for people they had every reason to hate. And she remembered how those small acts, those cookies and scarves and bars of soap, had accomplished what no amount of military defeat alone could achieve. They had broken through the armor of ideology and revealed a different possibility of how human beings might organize their societies and treat each other. Epilogue. The story of German women prisoners receiving gifts from American civilians is a minor footnote in the vast history of World War II. It involves no great battles, no strategic turning points, no famous personalities. The women involved were ordinary clerks and communications workers, young women who had believed what their government told them and found themselves on the wrong side of history. The American women who sent packages were equally ordinary, housewives and church ladies, teachers and farmers' wives, people with no special claim to moral superiority or historical significance. Yet this footnote illuminates something essential about the nature of ideological conflict and the sources of democratic strength. The Nazi regime built its entire edifice on the claim that only ruthlessness and racial purity could ensure national survival, that mercy was weakness and pluralism was degeneration. The United States, for all its flaws and contradictions, operated on different premises. That human dignity was universal, that prosperity could be shared, that even enemies deserved treatment that acknowledged their humanity. These were not just rhetorical claims. They manifested in the material reality of abundant food, in the legal protections of the Geneva Conventions enforced even when enemies violated them, in the willingness of civilians to extend mercy to prisoners who served a regime that had sought their destruction. The German women who experienced this found their entire worldview challenged not by propaganda, but by evidence, by the daily experience of living in a society that, however imperfectly, tried to honor its stated values. The chocolate and the scarves were symbols, but they were symbols of something real. The proposition that democracy's strength lay not in its capacity for violence, though it proved devastating in war, but in its capacity for abundance, innovation, and generosity. The United States defeated Nazi Germany with overwhelming military force, but defeated Nazi ideology by demonstrating that free societies can outproduce, out-innovate, and ultimately outlast authoritarian regimes while still maintaining, however imperfectly, the forms of mercy and justice that made them worth defending. The women who returned to Germany carried this knowledge with them. Some rejected it, clinging to old beliefs despite overwhelming contrary evidence. But others, like Greta Hoffmann, became quiet advocates for the democratic rebuilding of their shattered nation. They had seen the alternative, had lived in it and benefited from it, and they could not unsee it. When West Germany constructed its post-war identity as a democratic state committed to human rights and international cooperation, women like Greta were part of the social fabric that made that transformation possible and durable. The gray wool scarf, lovingly knitted by a woman in Baton Rouge and sent to a prisoner she would never meet, traveled across an ocean and survived decades of ordinary use. It was a small thing, a gesture of kindness that cost little and meant everything. It represented the truth that even in humanity's darkest moments, when nations mobilize for total war and ideologies justify unlimited violence, individual acts of mercy preserve the possibility of something better. This is the lesson that the German women prisoners learned in American camps, that abundance need not mean decadence, that freedom need not mean chaos, that democracy, for all its messiness and inefficiency, could generate both material prosperity and moral possibility that authoritarian systems could never match. They learned it not from lectures or propaganda, but from lived experience, from the simple fact of packages arriving at the gate, from chocolate and scarves and impossible generosity of enemies who insisted on treating them as human beings worthy of dignity. In the end, this was America's most powerful weapon. Not the B-17s that destroyed German cities or the Sherman tanks that rolled across the Rhine, but the capacity to win without losing sight of what made victory worth achieving. The women who received those gifts never forgot. Some of them, in the quiet moments of their post-war lives, must have reflected on the strange trajectory of history that brought them from the certainties of the Third Reich to the confusion and unexpected mercy of American captivity, and from there to the rebuilt democracy of modern Germany. The scarf remains, in Greta Hoffmann's family still, a museum piece now, a tangible connection to a moment when ideologies collided and one emerged superior not because of superior violence, but because of superior values. It is a reminder that in the contest between closed societies and open ones, between systems built on coercion and those built on consent, the outcome is not foreordained but depends on whether free peoples remember and honor the principles that justify their freedom. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson of Baton Rouge, knitting that scarf in the winter of 1944, could not have known all this. She knew only that a young woman was cold and far from home, and that she could help. That simple act of human kindness, multiplied across thousands of American civilians, became a weapon more powerful than any the arsenal of democracy produced. It became proof that the Allied cause was not just militarily superior, but morally superior, that the free world fought not just against fascism, but for something worth preserving and extending. This is what the chocolate and the scarves represented. The promise that abundance and generosity, freedom and dignity, could coexist and reinforce each other. That promise, delivered in ordinary packages to the ordinary mail, changed more minds than 1,000 propaganda films. It won a war not just of armies but of ideas, and in doing so, shaped the world that followed. The women who received those gifts became witnesses to this truth. They carried it home to Germany, into the Reconstruction, into the new democratic order that rose from the ruins. And somewhere in that process, in the quiet transformation of millions of individual consciences, the real victory was won, not on battlefields, but in moments of unexpected human connection, in the space between enemy and neighbor, in the revolutionary act of treating a prisoner with dignity and a stranger with kindness.